Patty and others told me that what we're going to have here is people from very different backgrounds. So I'm going to try and keep this very broad and not very technical. If you want to get technical about any of the pieces, I'm happy to talk to you more later about those and some things that didn't even make it into this talk. But for the moment, this is going to be more conceptual than a detailed, here's the last p-value of my research kind of talk. And before I start, this is a picture from an urban area in Ethiopia. I spend a lot of time in Ethiopia these days. There's a reason that I chose a picture from Ethiopia, and I'll get back to that in just a moment, and again at the end of the talk. What I want to talk about today is really the confluence of three of the biggest global issues we're dealing with today. And this one, climate change, is getting a lot of attention, whether it's because it's getting increasingly difficult to pretend it isn't happening, or because some very prominent people insist on pretending it isn't happening. But certainly, it's a topic that we talk about a lot. It's hard to open a serious newspaper and not see something to do with it. Human population is one that got a lot more attention 50, 60 years ago. It hasn't gone away, but we're not talking about it very much. But it's an important component of the story I want to tell you today. And then urbanization is the context for all of that for today. And again, here's this picture from Ethiopia. We're sitting in the first world. We're sitting in the US, one of the richest countries in the world. And certainly, and I'll show you some numbers in a moment, urbanization is something that happens here. It's a fact of life. But I want you to think as we go through this, and again, I'll come back to this at the very end, this is not unique to us. We're ahead of the curve, but all three of these things, climate change is affecting the global south more extensively, more extremely than it is us. Most of the population growth is happening in the global south. Africa is perhaps the fastest growing, followed by Asia. And urbanization is certainly something that's happening in the developing world very, very rapidly. So here's us, 200 years ago. Most of us lived in a rural environment. Vaguely 100 years ago, we flipped, we passed the 50-50 line. These days, only about a fifth of Americans live in rural environments. About 80% live in what is defined as urban environments. And just as a thought, when we say urban, most of us think New York City. There's a lot of people living in New York City, but most people do not live in places like New York City. Most people live in cities a lot more like this one. Both in terms of number of individuals and the number of urban centers, this is a lot more typical than the New York cities of the world. Okay, this is probably not shocking to anyone, but here's the numbers for the world at large. 1950, only about 30% or so of the world population lived in cities, about 700 million people or so. Today, vaguely, 3.5 billion people, roughly half the world population lives in cities. The second quintile passed the 50-50 mark at the turn of the century. The third quintile in terms of national richness passed it a couple of years ago. And the two poorest quintiles of countries are very much on a track up. They're catching up. By the middle of this century, the prediction is about 6.5 billion people live in cities worldwide, and that's roughly 70% of the human population. We don't talk about that much, we don't think about that much, we rarely think about the consequences for tomorrow and for today. It's the planning we need to do today to address that. And honestly, I don't know why. This is, to my mind, one of the biggest things happening in our world, and we're more or less ignoring it, and it's going to come back. It's already coming back to bite us. Already, cities generate about 80% of the world's economy. So even though only about half of the world population lives in cities, most of the product in one way or another, most of the GDP comes from cities. And on the back end of it, most of the energy use and the production of climate change gases that follows is either in the city or directly related to consumption by the cities. So even for something that is already a big part of the world, the impact of cities already is much beyond the scale. Okay, so part one, there's more cities every day. Part two, the human population growing. This is from UN predictions in 2004, so 15 years ago. They're saying their low scenarios is we'll stabilize around 7.5 billion people and then go down. We're already there today. We're not going down. Like most of the UN predictions, their worst case scenario tends to be optimistic 20 years later. What they were calling their medium scenario has us stabilizing around 9 billion people. And that seems to be the most optimistic model I'm seeing today. Their high scenario at the time was talking about 14 billion people. The sort of reasonable predictions I'm hearing today are by the middle of this century, by the end of this century, we'll be at around 11 billion or so. Where exactly is this going to stop depends on too many factors that nobody's very good at predicting. What's pretty obvious is more than today, a lot more than today. And again, a lot of them are either already in cities or moving to cities tomorrow. With those cities, with that population comes what we're calling the footprint. So here's the Earth from space at night. You can see the lights everywhere. Here's another way of looking at the footprint. So here's the human population in blue. Here's in orange, extinctions of other species. The shape is pretty much the same, a little bit behind. But the more people, the more extinctions. Here's another way of looking at it, and this is the third theme for this talk, is climate. This is average world temperature, and it doesn't matter exactly how you calculate that, but the trend is kind of hard to ignore. It's getting warmer on average, and it's not just getting warmer, we're getting more extreme weather. And that, again, is disproportionately affecting urban areas. So we just had a few weeks ago a big cyclone, Idai, come across in Africa. Hit Mozambique and Zimbabwe. As of yesterday, they were saying there's over 700 dead. They're expecting there's probably more. I think the current number is about 2 million people dispossessed, displaced. There's something or other, and again, these numbers are very preliminary probably. But when something like that comes through a dense urban area, the impact is a lot greater than if it comes through a rural area. Okay, so I can, in my brain, my telepathic brain, hear some of you going, I'm a water engineer or whatever. Let the people drown, who cares? So here's something I picked out of Fortune magazine just a few weeks ago. The timing was perfect. I was at an airport on the way to Ethiopia, and I ran into this issue of Fortune magazine. And they talked to a whole bunch of economic experts and asked them, what scares you? So they asked them, what scares you? And then they put bigger towers to represent the things that people more often said they worried about. And all the ones that you see here in red are related to climate change. Every last one. So these are economists. These are not ecologists. I'm an ecologist. They're not conservation biologists. They're not development experts. They're economists. They're supposed to be the ones who are clear-headed and not worried about pamby-namby things like lizards. I care about lizards. And they worry about climate change. Yesterday, I heard Janet Napolitano on NPR. She was asked, what is the greatest national security crisis for the U.S. today? She said climate change. So, a lot of people worry about climate change and what that is doing. And a lot of it is tied with water, which is what brought me here today. Too much water. This is flooding in the U.S. right now. This is in Iowa. Houses underwater, neighborhoods underwater. And again, you put people together in cities and the impacts are magnified tremendously. On the flip side of that, too little water. This is, again, more or less now in Nevada, reservoirs running dry because of droughts. We're getting flooding, we're getting droughts. And sometimes, to make life even more interesting, we're getting everything. So here's Jakarta, Indonesia. This story is from last year. Jakarta is sinking. What you're seeing here is in red places that are sinking more than 2 inches a year. The city is going down more than 2 inches every year. In yellow, it's 1 inch or so a year. Why is it sinking? Because they're pumping out too much water from the aquifer. People need water. The aquifer goes away, the city is sinking. As a result of that, combined with climate change, rising water levels, and storms, more and more of the city is underwater. Okay, so all these things tying together, where does urban ecology fit into all of this? We'll get there in a second. First of all, here's a European document looking at planning for 2030. Came out a few years ago. And what I want to point out is one of the issues they worry about is urbanization. I don't think you can read that from where you are. Bottom line is these are all big cities, and they're asking how are the changes in where people are, how many people are there, going to affect the broad global patterns that have to do with terrorism, to go back to national security, suffering in terms of starvation and disease and so on. Here's an American document looking basically at tomorrow at this point. One of the things they're looking at is urbanization and the fact that people movements that can result from climate change, can result from changes in economics, really affect pattern tremendously. People moving into cities, especially if they don't have jobs, they don't have places to live, create tremendous instability. That has broad impacts that go not just locally, not just nationally, but internationally. A few years ago, the US still believed in climate change, tried to ask, what is that going to do? One of their chapters, chapter 11, had to do with urban environments, and I want to share with you 2 of their broad conclusions. One is urban infrastructure has to be able to deal with a climate that's different than what we're used to. We have been planning for a world that looks like yesterday. Tomorrow doesn't look like yesterday. We need to plan differently. And we need to do that today so that things don't fall on us tomorrow. The next is, and this is getting a little bit closer to where I'm trying to go with the big picture here, climate change can exacerbate existing challenges, and there's plenty of challenges in cities, especially the big cities, especially big cities in developing countries, to urban quality of life, so people, including social inequality. We don't talk about that very much, but that's a big part of the story. And again, often more extremely so in the developing world than here. Aging and deteriorating infrastructure, certainly an issue in most of the cities in the US. And stressed ecosystems. Now my ecology is starting to come into it. So a few examples of that. We're going to have heat waves. Well, an engineering kind of problem. We're going to need more electricity for the air conditioning. And we're going to build our roads, hopefully, so they don't fall apart because of expansion and shrinkage. We're going to have droughts, water shortages. We're already seeing that. Where's the water coming from? How do we deal with residents in the US who like to take very long showers and really love living in Lubbock, Texas, with his 18 inches of rain a year, really love their Bermuda grass and believe in watering it and immediately mowing it and watering it and then immediately mowing it again? How do we deal with that? Where do we get that water? Quality is going to suffer as well. Extreme rains, flooding. Doesn't have to come with a huge storm. The rains we are getting in many parts are coming in fewer, bigger rain bursts. In many cases, our system is not designed to handle that. All of those things, and we tend to think of ourselves because we are people, we are the center of the universe, it all revolves around us, right? But all of these things that affect us affect other species that live with us in the urban environment, and that's where I'm going to go next. Other species that live outside of the urban environment, and I don't have the time to deal with that today. So a little bit about urban ecology. And again, I know there's a number of you, at least who are biologists. I would love to talk to you more about that. It's one of my passions. But I'm just going to scratch the surface today. I only have 3 slides on this. So this, we were talking earlier about box turtles. This is the box turtle that's found, this is outside my personal yard. We have urban box turtles. Box turtles are declining throughout their range. There's a dozen or so species. All of them are in one or another level of trouble. And yet we have them in town. This one has a little radio transmitter attached to it. We had a student, several students actually, follow them around, find out how they live in town. But I'm not going to talk about that. In fact, there's wildlife everywhere. So some examples, New York City Central Park, there's a raccoon. People like going out at night and seeing them. Now, if you've met a raccoon, you know they're not very friendly creatures. You don't want them as a pet most of the time, but they can be fun to watch. Here we are in Brazil, the southern end of Brazil, Iguaçu Falls, a relative of the raccoon coatis, found in a major tourist attraction on the edge of town. For the same reason, there's trash cans, they come and eat there. Doing very, very well right next to people. British Virgin Islands, so now we're in the Caribbean. This is an introduced African gecko that's found throughout the Caribbean, only in urban environments. Does very well around people. Here we are in the middle of Tel Aviv, Israel. There's a park sort of vaguely like the Central Park in New York. In the last few years, jackals have moved in, doing very, very well. Again, people like watching them. They're cute. They sing at night. It's cool to hear if you happen to be biologically inclined. Here we are in South Africa, on the edge of Cape Town. We've got a whole bunch of penguins doing very, very well. People like them. Tourists come to see them and hear them and honestly smell them. They smell. But you've got a whole bunch of species doing very well right next to people, pretty much in urban environments throughout the world. Most people don't appreciate that. Most of the time you talk to Joe Public or Jane Public, and the context they think of things about is the plague. Ah, yes, rats give us the plague. That's the only concern we have about wildlife is when it's a nuisance. Okay, well, you know, we're all academics. We look down on the public. They don't know. They're the unwashed masses, whatever. Stupidity, we tell ourselves. But it's not just them, it's us. So, in fact, the scientific world massively underappreciates the importance of urban ecology in my mind. So here is the number of studies per year for 3 categories. So here in A is a search in Google Scholar for urban ecology. And what you can see is, going back to the 1900s, nobody was talking about it at all. Of course, there aren't that many people living in cities and not many biggish cities. By the end of last century, the numbers are picking up. We now have more or less 3,000 paper or so every decade or so. Okay. Here, B is looking for wildlife conflict. And throughout that time, that starts way back, even today, you have a lot more papers dealing with wildlife conflict than with urban ecology. Here in C is looking for human dimensions of wildlife while removing conflict. So this is simplistically a search for positive papers or papers about positive interactions with wildlife in urban environments. And you can see that there's almost nothing, but even today, notice the scale, this is 300, this is 3,000. So even today, when we have papers about wildlife in an urban context, it's almost always in the context of conflict somehow. The birds pooped on my car and I really don't like it. The rats ate my food and I really don't like it. We don't talk so much about the, oh wow, I saw this cool coati over there. Some of our own work, just to give you a sense of 2 extremes of that. Here's a study we did in town. So this is the city of Lubbock. Within the city, and this is a feature of our part of the world, there are these seasonal rain ponds. We're very, very flat. Very, very flat. When it does rain, the rain runs down into little depressions. They might not fill for a couple of years. When they do fill, the amphibians come out. And we did this study during the worst drought in our recorded history. A lot of the playas in town didn't have any frogs at all, any amphibians at all. The ones on the edge, many had some. Bottom line is we were able to come up with a model of what traits of a playa, of one of these lakes, make it attractive to amphibians. And then when the rains came back the next year, show that a really horrible drought nonetheless allows you to make predictions about normal years. But here we are in the middle of a city of about 250,000 people, and there's a whole bunch of frogs that still do okay. At the other end of the scale, this looks at the entire Caribbean basin. So this is South America, Central America, that's the end of Florida there, all the islands in between. We looked at the introduced reptiles and amphibians recorded in this entire area. And the bottom line is, there's 2 bottom lines really. One you see here. This thick line in the middle is economic activity. All these other lines show you the numbers of particular groups of non-natives. The more economic activity, the more non-natives come in. The other take-home message is already in the title. Almost all of those are found in urban setting. In many cases, they don't leave the towns at all. They come in with either a pet trader or an ornamental plant trader, or just with the stuff we bring in to build, and they don't leave. To really quickly point out, most of our studies, and that's certainly true for most of my work, the work of my students, looks at what comes into the city. But we have growing evidence, and this is just one recent paper that Kevin Gaston and some of his group put together, point out that cities aren't just a place, they are a novel evolutionary setting. And because of that, there's actually a lot of selection that happens in them. We are creating a whole bunch of new creatures out there. They're coming in from the outside, whether it's by boat or because they fly in or walk in or whatever. But then they are experiencing such a different world, such a novel evolutionary environment that they're changing. This is not just a passive thing. This is an active thing. Okay. So those are the three themes, very quick visits into all three of them. And what I want to point out in bringing all of this together, which I've sort of thrown in bits and pieces at you, is that in my mind, urban ecology offers a way forward in conservation much more broadly. Why is that? So here's a paper that Susan Walls published last year. And this is one of a whole series of papers you can find more or less the last 20 years or so that increasingly talk about what medical doctors call triage. Look, we don't have enough resources to save everything. Ain't gonna happen. So how do we decide this one lives and this one dies? Not an easy choice. A lot of argument over that, a lot of discussion about the ethical underpinnings of that, but increasing realization that much as we would like to save everything, we're not going to be able to. And so Susan was asking, so, okay, given that we've got constraints, we're not going to have enough money, we're not going to have enough time, we're not going to have enough land, how do we most effectively use what we have? And she came up with three things. Basically, talk to people, make people more engaged, create more and more stakeholders, what you were talking about earlier, right? Get them involved. Number two is get better at sampling. How do we get more data about what's there, where it's going, how many there are, quicker and more efficiently? And three is, how do we avoid waiting until there's two of something and it costs $1 trillion to not save them? How do we start earlier when there's more of them and it costs less and there's actually a biologically plausible story forward? How do we do conservation for common species? How do we keep them common? Most of the time in conservation these days, we deal with threatened and endangered species. We wait until there's three. We mostly focus on mammals and birds. Occasionally we do other things, but mostly we talk about these two. We have a very strong bias there. And then, oh my God, we run into action. How do we not wait for that? How do we do things before they're a disaster? I don't think urban does anything for number two, but I want to make the case that for 1 and 3, urban environments, urban ecology are a key. So, stakeholder involvement. Here's information. The New York Times, about 6 months ago, almost a year ago now, put out a little calculator. You would put in where you lived and when you were born, and it would tell you how many hot days when you were born and how many today and how many by the end of the century. What better way to bring climate change home to somebody than to bring it home? When I was born, I wasn't born in Lubbock, but had I been born in Lubbock, there were so many hot days. There's a lot more now. By the time I'm ready to die, there'll be a lot more. By the time my children are ready to die, there'll be even more. This is not an abstract thing. This is about me, where I live, and my comfort level. This is something I can connect with. Another issue I'm personally really interested in is night lights. What are they doing? Again, here are places with very high light intensity in the world. Here's a map of urban locations, and you can see there's a very good correlation. Big cities make a lot of light. Again, it brings it home. You're the one making the lights. Here's the same map of cities. Here, all these lines are movements of ships across the globe. Not surprisingly, the ships connect major urban centers. And those major urban centers are where you find lots of invasive species. So the redder it is, the more invasive species you find. Again, this is not random. This is not abstract. This is not out in the middle of nowhere. This is you where you live. It's a way to bring things to people and make them personal. And this is our Wildlife Rehabilitation Center in Lubbock. My students and I have done a bunch of work with them over the years. This is one of the ways that urban populations come in contact with wildlife. Now, it's not very wild life, right? There's not lions and elephants roaming around the cities of Lubbock or the city of Tuscaloosa, probably. But they come across wildlife, they bring it in because they find it and they care about it. They have an area where they do public shows. They go to school with animals. They bring it into people. They make it personal. They make people care. And people that care about the wildlife next door maybe actually care about the wildlife in Ethiopia as well. This is the door to my backyard. So this is my bedroom here. This goes to our pond. And this fox has been visiting us for the last few weeks. There's actually 2 of them. They're not particularly friendly. You open the door and they run away, but they don't particularly care. So, in summary, what urban offers us, I think, is a place to demonstrate crucial issues where people live, to get people engaged in acknowledging the problems and maybe wanting to solve them. Things like nightlights and climate change, but also things like water, the problems of water. What do we do about water? How do we plan for all of these things? How do we build a city that is more resilient? And guess what? A city that does better for people also does better for other species. One of our economists did a project looking at home values and number of birds. Places that have more birds, the houses are worth more. Now, is our home buyer saying, I'm willing to pay more for this house because it's got more bird species? Probably not. But the home buyer is looking at the vegetation, looking at whatever else, saying, I like that, and so do the birds. So do the turtles, so do the foxes. What is good for the wildlife is good for the people. What's good for the people is good for the wildlife. So it's a place for urbanites who are otherwise mostly living in their cell phones these days to come across a fox or at the very least a pigeon. Some of these are very common. Some of these are perhaps invasive. Some of them are not. The fox is a native species and it's not highly endangered, but there's not trillions of them. And again, in the very closing, bring this back to the developing world. I started with Ethiopia. All of this is even more true in the developing world, both because some of the problems are bigger, the population is growing faster, but also because they are urbanizing now. Now is the time to bring in the lessons we've learned or are trying to learn or should be learning about how to build better cities so that they build it right the first time. Ethiopia, to stick to that country, pretty much completely skipped landlines. The old phones connected to the wall, pretty much never had them in most of the countries. They went straight to cell phones. Can we do the same here? Can we skip the mistakes we made in building our cities? And as they build theirs, as they're putting a lot of resources into developing theirs, can we move straight ahead to a city that is designed for the world of tomorrow and is designed to deal not just with people and their needs, and there's lots of people and lots of needs, but also to be more friendly to a whole bunch of other species. And I think that's as far as I'm going to go today. Thank you very much. And hopefully that leaves us some time for questions. Yes, sir.
So I found it interesting that most of the species that tend to do really well in urban environments are invasive species, or at least introduced species. That seems to be a pretty uniform trend globally.
I think you may be overstressing the point a little bit, but certainly the species you see everywhere you go, the pigeons, the rats, and so on, they're generally non-native. There's quite a variety of species that do really well around people. Some are really horrible around people. And again, we did a study on birds. You can divide the urban birds in Lubbock, and it's pretty typical, into three groups. The ones that are the non-natives, the starlings, the pigeons, that love people. You really don't find them away from the people. You go just on the edge of town and they're mostly gone. Then there's the other extreme, the species that are native, that are very sensitive to people, that you find either on the edge of town or in the yards like mine that are crazy, that have lots of native species and multiple levels and lots of mess. And you find them in my yard, but nowhere else. And then there's a third group of native species that are pretty resistant. Blue jays are a good example of that. Cardinals are a fairly good example of that. Robins, American robins, are a good example of that. They're native, but they are quite patient with people. They get used to us. They are able to exploit some of the resources we offer. So you're going to find some of those. So anywhere you go, there's going to be a cadre of species that's pretty much global. The pigeons, the sparrows, almost anywhere you go, you're going to run into them. And then there's a whole bunch of native species you're never going to see in the city. But then there's a whole bunch of species. The crow family is a very good example of that. Almost anywhere you go, you're going to find some kind of crowish thing, often right in the middle of the city. They're smart, they're tolerant, they can use the resources we offer, they're happy. Okay? Does that more or less answer your question?
It does. So for example, the African gecko, you mentioned that, I think it was in the Virgin Islands, is really successful in cities around lights. Are they also really successful in Africa around lights?
You know, that species was probably brought in around slavery times. It's actually got a fairly narrow distribution in Africa. It's doing much better in its introduced range than in the native range. Some of the other geckos that you find here, and earlier today I was talking to one of your colleagues here, Steve Secor. We were talking about Mediterranean geckos. Yes, they do very well around people in the native range, and they have been for thousands of years because there's been thousands of years of civilization for them to get used to it. So they've done well there. They've moved in with people there. When people moved, they moved with them. Okay? So certainly night lights, and again, I didn't go into that today at all, but they're one of those novel human environments that creates an opportunity for a whole bunch of species. Most of the time, it's species that are very human tolerant in the native range. And so when they are transported, they come into a place that looks just like home. There's buildings, there's lights, there's the same inverts in many cases to eat. They're happy, they do well. Okay?
Thanks.
Yes, ma'am.
How do you suggest that we better integrate these ideas of urban ecology in the undergraduate curriculum? Like, for instance, here, I teach conservation biology, and I touch on some of these things, but I don't focus on it in a given period of time. And we don't have an urban ecology course in the department.
So here's a thought, and I don't know how you teach your class, and it certainly wasn't in there when I first designed the conservation biology class in my university, right? So I think it's a very common issue. One of the things we're trying to do more and more with classes is not just, I'm there talking at you. It's actually taking students and doing something in the field. And urban environments make a great opportunity for students to explore, whether it's methodologies that learn about radio tracking or measuring tree width or observing birds. If there is a hands-on component to your class, if there is a class project that they do individually or in groups. A lot of these things you can easily do just outside your door. And it's not go to the library and read something, it's go out and actually look at the gecko or the bird or whatever. To my mind, that's more meaningful, and it's right next door. You don't have to send them anywhere, you don't have to pay anything, it's right there. And we're actually extending it to graduate education, and a growing number of our graduate students are doing projects in town. It's quick, it's easy, it's cheap, and we're learning a lot. Okay? I think there was one more question. Yes, ma'am.
How to better educate the public? For example, you talk about various animals thriving in a more affluent community. At the same time, these more affluent communities are cutting down the trees and building in floodplains and calling their development whatever, Fox Run Meadow, as the fox now comes into the yard, and people see them more as a nuisance. Or they're worried about the coyote eating their dog or something like that. How do we do a better job of educating the public about that sort of thing?
I wish I had a simple answer for you. I don't. You know, that fox, those foxes, my wife is on a neighborhood internet-based group. And there's people there, oh my God, there's a fox, it's gonna eat my children, it's gonna eat my cat. It's smaller than your children, it's about the same size as your cat. It's not gonna eat them. She's much better than I am at conveying that message to people. So part of it is just engaging. A lot of it is things in my mind like the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. They do that all the time. They go to classes and deal with people all the time. We've got a program called Texas Master Naturalists. These are lay people who are interested in nature. Every other year or so they bring me in to talk about reptiles and amphibians, but we talked about urban issues as well. These are the people who talk to people. Training the trainers is the terminology that the international development people use for that. I think the bigger problem is a step back from that. We as biologists, we as academics, we as conservation biologists tend to look at urban environments as trash, as worthless wastes of time. Now, don't get me wrong, I did most of my PhD in Costa Rica, in Corcovado National Park. It's beautiful. I love the tropics. It's very pristine. 6 species of wild cats and macaws and tapirs, and it's very cool. But there's less and less of that every day and more of the Lubbock kind of place, the Tuscaloosa kind of place. If we only focus on the Corcovado kind of place, we've lost. We have to bring it to people, and the urban environment is one that is right there. I don't think we're doing a very good job, and I think at least part of it is because we don't believe in it. We don't see it as a worthwhile endeavor. I think the first step is to fix our own blind spot before we go preaching at others. We have to change how we look at things and how we think. So it's not a very good answer for you. I'm sorry, but it's the best I have. Anyone else?
Time for one more. Okay, no.
It's been suggested that we need to redefine nature. Mm-hmm. Like you were talking with urban spaces, like some of the most wild spaces that I've ever seen are in urban spaces, whereas we think of parks as being pristine, national parks, all these, but they're very maintained versus a place that's been abandoned in a city, and I think which is closer to where people live, right? Like it's very difficult for the majority of people to go to a national park, which is very iconic, but it's absent of both humans, which are part of nature, and they're very maintained. Whereas an abandoned lot in a neighborhood could be one of the most wild places you could imagine that's around, because it's left to nature.
One of my colleagues, Mark Stoll, is a historian, And he points out that when the U.S. invented the concept of the national park, he's very interested in the religious roots of that, but one of the core elements was kicking out the people. If you look at the early pictures, all these beautiful sceneries, and there's not a person to be seen anywhere near them. We took them and removed them because philosophically they were not part of our perception of, to use your word, pristine. My argument is especially with climate change. So I'm sorry, I'm going to steal this for a moment. I've got a piece of crap, I throw it over there. Okay, this is not pristine. There you go. Back in one piece. I'm not throwing it in Corcovado National Park in Costa Rica, right? But the climate there is changing because of what I'm putting in the air here. There is no more pristine. Nothing is unaffected by what we do. And we're increasingly having to come to terms with that, and it hurts. It sucks. I think what you're saying is correct, but it's a step further than most people are willing to go. Many people are not even willing to accept that there's no more pristine left. But even those who are, to go all the way here and say, okay, because there is no more pristine, maybe the city, which is about as non-pristine as you can get, right? This is the most artificial environment possible, maybe other than the middle of a nuclear reactor. This is also habitat. It's also worthy of conservation in some way. But that's a big step, and it's not an easy transition. It's a deeply philosophical transition, which we're struggling with. But I think we're going to have to make. There's no way around it.
Okay,
One more quick one. How, the urban planning community, how are they accepting these kinds of ideas? What are they doing in terms of trying to think about urban ecology?
It depends on where you are. In some places, they're way ahead of anybody else. And again, it's because urban trees make shade, which is good for people. They clean the air, which is good for people. They're also taking up carbon that reduces climate change. So in many ways, this is multitasking for them. It's a win-win-win sort of thing. To get them to think about what's good for the fox, that's very difficult. And in many places, in Lubbock, there's just starting to say that they think they might want to eventually think about this. So in some places, they're a long way from this. In some places, cities, Austin in Texas is an example, are leading the way. In many ways, there's a few cities that have done an incredible job. So it depends on the location.
okay, we've got to wrap, unfortunately, but Gad's around for the rest of the afternoon, and he's got a meeting for folks, but if you want to talk, we can plug you in sometime, somehow, some way.
Thanks for coming, guys.